Most people think the worst day of your life is the day someone you love dies. They're wrong. Sometimes the worst day comes a few days later, when the people still standing show you who they really are. My name is Cole Harrison. I'm 39 years old, born and raised in Texas, and until 5 years ago, I thought I understood loss. I thought I understood loyalty too. Turns out I understood neither. The sky over Oak Hill Cemetery was the color of wet concrete the morning we buried my father. A cold wind rolled across the grass, bending the flags near the veterans section and rattling the bare branches above us. I stood beside the casket in a black suit that suddenly felt 2 sizes too heavy. My hands were shoved into my pockets because I didn't trust them not to shake. My father, William Harrison, had been my anchor for as long as I could remember. He wasn't a wealthy man. At least that's what everyone believed. He drove the same aging Ford F-150 for nearly 15 years. He lived in the same modest ranch house outside Fort Worth. He wore work boots until the soles were nearly smooth. The kind of man who fixed things instead of replacing them. The kind of man who always showed up. Growing up, I thought he knew everything. As I got older, I realized he didn't know everything. He just never stopped trying. That's a different kind of wisdom. The pastor spoke about character, about quiet strength, about integrity, words that sounded almost old-fashioned in a world obsessed with status and attention. I remember staring at the polished wood of the casket and wondering how a man could spend his whole life doing the right thing and still end up leaving so quietly. Around me, people dabbed their eyes and exchanged soft condolences. I barely heard any of it. Grief has a strange way of muting the world. Everything becomes distant, like you're listening through a wall. Rebecca stood beside me during the service. My wife of 11 years. Tall, elegant, perfectly composed. Her black coat fit like it had been tailored for a magazine photo shoot. She looked appropriate, respectful, supportive, at least from a distance. Looking back, that's what haunts me. Nothing seemed obviously wrong. There were no arguments, no dramatic scenes, no warning signs flashing in bright red letters. Just a growing silence I was too exhausted to question. Brandon Pierce stood nearby too. My best friend since college. We'd shared apartments, road trips, business ideas, bad decisions, and more Friday night beers than I could count. If someone had asked me then who I trusted most in the world, after my father, Brandon would have been near the top of the list. Funny how life works. Sometimes the people standing closest to you are already halfway out the door. The funeral ended just after noon. People drifted away in small groups. Cars disappeared down the winding cemetery road. Eventually, only a handful of us remained. I remember standing there alone for a moment after everyone else started leaving. The fresh dirt looked darker than the ground around it. Final. Permanent. I wasn't ready to walk away. Not yet. My father had spent his last months battling illness with the same stubborn determination he'd used his entire life. Even near the end, he'd worried more about me than himself. "You'll be all right, son," he told me during our final conversation. "Just remember what matters." At the time, I thought he meant family. I thought he meant marriage. I thought he meant loyalty. I nodded and promised him I'd remember. 3 days later, Rebecca handed me divorce papers at our kitchen table. The house smelled like coffee and rain. A storm had settled over Fort Worth overnight, leaving gray clouds pressed low against the windows. I hadn't slept much. Grief does that. I sat staring at the stack of documents while my mind struggled to catch up with reality. She didn't cry. She didn't look angry. She looked relieved. That was somehow worse. "I think this is best for both of us," she said calmly. The words landed with all the warmth of a bank notice. I looked up at her and searched for the woman I'd married. The woman who once promised we'd face everything together. I couldn't find her. Then I noticed a vehicle parked across the street. A black SUV. Familiar. Brandon's. My stomach tightened. Not because I understood everything yet. Because some part of me already did. Rebecca followed my gaze toward the window. For the briefest moment, something flickered across her face. Guilt. Embarrassment. Maybe neither. Maybe both. Then it disappeared. "Cole," she said softly, "you need to move forward. Move forward." 3 days after burying my father. 3 days after saying goodbye to the only man who had never failed me. I stared at the papers again. The signatures. The legal language. The neat little boxes waiting for mine. Outside, rain tapped against the glass. Inside, something much quieter cracked. What I didn't know then was that losing my wife wasn't the end of the story. And what Rebecca and Brandon didn't know was that my father had left behind one final secret, a secret so enormous it would change every life connected to his forever. The divorce papers sat untouched on my kitchen table for 2 days. I could not bring myself to sign them, but I could not bring myself to throw them away either. They remained there beside a cold coffee mug and a stack of sympathy cards from people who still believed the hardest part of my life was already behind me. Looking back, that version of me feels almost innocent. I still thought pain arrived one disaster at a time. I still believed loyalty had rules. The truth was far messier. My father used to say that character is easiest to see when nobody is watching. When I was 8 years old, he took me to a small hardware store on the edge of town. The cashier accidentally gave him $20 too much in change. We were halfway to the truck when he counted the bills and turned around. I remember complaining because it was hot outside and I wanted to go home. He smiled and handed the money back anyway. On the drive home, he told me something I never forgot. He said that integrity is what you do when keeping the money would be easier. At the time, it sounded like one of those lessons parents repeat because they are supposed to. Years later, I realized he lived by that principle every day of his life. My childhood was not glamorous. We lived in a modest ranch house outside Fort Worth surrounded by open fields and long stretches of road that seemed to disappear into the horizon. Summer afternoons smelled like cut grass and motor oil. My father repaired equipment for local businesses and farmers. He worked hard, came home tired, and somehow still found time to show up at every baseball game, every school event, every moment that mattered. We were never rich. At least that is what I believed. We paid our bills. We kept the lights on. We fixed things instead of replacing them. Life felt ordinary. The kind of ordinary you do not appreciate until it is gone. Rebecca never understood that world. When I first met her, she was ambitious, intelligent, and determined to build a bigger life than the one she grew up with. That was part of what attracted me to her. She had goals. She had drive. She talked about cities she wanted to visit and careers she wanted to build. Back then, those dreams felt exciting. They felt like possibilities. Somewhere along the way, they became expectations. Then they became measurements. Eventually, they became disappointments. The changes happened slowly enough that I barely noticed them. That is the dangerous thing about cracks. They rarely appear all at once. They spread quietly beneath the surface. A comment here, a complaint there. A comparison you tell yourself does not matter. Rebecca started talking more about people who seemed successful. Bigger homes, luxury vacations, executive titles, expensive neighborhoods. I usually laughed it off. I believed we were building something meaningful together. I thought stability mattered more than appearances. Brandon always seemed to agree. That is what makes the memory sting now. He sat at our dinner table dozens of times. He shared holiday meals with us. He listened to Rebecca complain about traffic, work, and life while nodding sympathetically. If there were warning signs, I missed them completely. Maybe because I trusted both of them. Maybe because my attention was somewhere else. My father's health had been declining for nearly a year before he died. Doctor appointments became part of our routine. So did hospital visits, long drives, test results, new medications, conversations nobody wants to have. The closer the end came, the more time I spent with him. I do not regret a single minute of it. Some evenings we sat on his back porch watching the Texas sunset paint the sky orange and gold. We talked about everything and nothing. Sports, work, family, life. He never complained much, even when walking became difficult, even when simple tasks exhausted him. He carried himself with the same quiet dignity I had admired my entire life. One evening, a few weeks before he passed, he stared across the pasture behind his house and asked me a question that seemed strange at the time. "Who stays when things get hard?" he said. I remember shrugging. "Family," I answered. He smiled but did not look convinced. Then he nodded slowly and changed the subject. At the time, I thought he was reflecting on his illness. Now I wonder if he already knew something I did not. Because while I was focused on spending time with my father, other things were happening around me. Conversations I never heard. Decisions I never saw. Plans forming quietly behind closed doors. And although I did not know it then, the people I trusted most had already started preparing for a future they believed would not include me. After Rebecca left the house that morning, I sat alone at the kitchen table and stared at the rain crawling down the window. The divorce papers were still in front of me. The signature line waited patiently, like it knew time was on its side. I should have been angry. Most people probably would have been. Instead, I felt something colder. Confusion has a weight to it. It settles into your chest and makes every answer feel just out of reach. For the next week, I moved through my days like a man walking through fog. Friends called. Neighbors stopped by. People brought casseroles and condolences. They talked about my father. They told stories about his kindness. They said things would get easier with time. I nodded and thanked them. What I did not tell anyone was that every night I sat in the dark living room replaying the last year of my life. Looking back, the clues were there. Small enough to ignore at the time. Impossible to ignore now. Rebecca had started working later and later. At first it sounded reasonable. New projects. New responsibilities. New opportunities. I wanted to support her ambitions, so I never questioned it. Brandon seemed busier too. Sometimes he would cancel plans at the last minute. Other times he would disappear for days before returning my calls. Whenever I asked, there was always an explanation. Work, travel, family obligations, normal things, ordinary things, the kind of things that never raise alarms when trust already exists. One afternoon, I found myself scrolling through old photographs on my phone. Family cookouts, football games, holiday dinners. There were dozens of pictures with Brandon standing beside us, smiling, laughing, looking exactly like the friend I believed him to be. Then I noticed something I had missed before. Rebecca always seemed to be near him, not suspiciously close, not enough to draw attention, just close enough to appear repeatedly in frame after frame. My stomach tightened. It was not evidence. It was not proof. It was simply the first time I allowed myself to look at those memories differently. The following day, I stopped by a local coffee shop on my way home. Fort Worth traffic crawled through a light drizzle, and I needed something to occupy my mind. As I waited for my order, I heard two women talking quietly at a nearby table. One of them mentioned Rebecca by name. I was not trying to listen, but when you hear your wife's name a week after she leaves you, your attention sharpens automatically. They spoke about a charity fundraiser from months earlier. One woman casually mentioned seeing Rebecca and Brandon together after the event had ended. Nothing inappropriate, nothing dramatic, just together, alone, long after everyone else had gone home. The conversation lasted less than a minute, yet it echoed in my head the entire drive back. What I did not understand then was how long the story had already been unfolding without me. A few days later, I opened an old email account searching for tax documents. Instead, I found photographs from a company retreat nearly 8 months earlier. I remembered that weekend. My father had been in the hospital. I stayed behind to help him while Rebecca attended alone. At least that is what I thought. In one picture, a group of employees stood on the patio of a resort outside Austin. Rebecca was there. Brandon was there too. He had told me he was attending a conference in Dallas that same weekend. I stared at the image for a long time. Maybe it meant nothing. Maybe it meant everything. That was the problem. The more pieces I collected, the more the puzzle began forming a picture I did not want to see. My father once told me that the truth does not usually arrive like lightning. It arrives like sunrise. Slowly, quietly, one detail at a time until the darkness has nowhere left to hide. By the end of that week, I stopped asking whether something had happened between them. Deep down, I already knew. The real question was how long it had been happening. And the answer, I suspected, was going to hurt far more than the divorce itself. The answer arrived on a Thursday afternoon. Not through a confession. Not through a dramatic confrontation. Just a photograph. Funny how entire lives can change because of a single image. I was sitting in my father's old recliner when my phone buzzed. Outside, the Texas sky was clear for the first time in weeks. Sunlight spilled across the hardwood floor, warming a house that somehow felt colder every day. The message came from someone I barely knew. A woman named Karen Mitchell. She had attended the same company retreat where Rebecca and Brandon had been photographed months earlier. The message was short. I think you deserve to know the truth. Attached was a picture taken during the final night of the retreat. A group of employees stood around a fire pit near the resort. Most were laughing. Some held drinks. Others looked toward the camera. Rebecca and Brandon stood off to one side, away from everyone else, looking at each other with a familiarity that no longer required explanation. I stared at the image for a long time, not because it revealed something new, because it confirmed what I had already begun to understand. There comes a moment when suspicion stops being suspicion, a moment when your mind finally catches up with what your heart has known all along. I did not call Rebecca. I did not call Brandon. I simply sat there listening to the hum of the air conditioner and the distant sound of traffic outside. The house felt strangely quiet, as if it already knew two people had left and were never truly coming back. Over the following days, more pieces appeared. Small pieces, harmless by themselves, devastating together. Social media posts, photos from events, comments from mutual friends who assumed I already knew. Looking back, I realized how carefully they had managed the illusion. They never behaved recklessly. They never gave people a reason to gossip openly. They simply moved through the world with the confidence of people who believe they would never face consequences. The hardest realization was not that Rebecca had chosen someone else. The hardest realization was understanding how long she had been emotionally gone before she physically left. I remembered dinners where she barely looked up from her phone, weekends where she seemed distracted, conversations that felt one-sided. At the time, I blamed stress, work, life, grief, anything except the truth. My father once told me that people rarely leave all at once. First, they leave in their thoughts, then in their priorities, then eventually in reality. One evening, nearly 3 weeks after the divorce papers appeared, I drove past a restaurant near downtown Fort Worth. I had no destination in mind. I just needed to get out of the house. Through the front windows, I saw them. Rebecca and Brandon sitting together at a corner table, laughing, comfortable, relaxed. The kind of comfort that only exists when two people no longer feel the need to hide. I pulled into a parking lot across the street and sat there for several minutes. I expected anger. Instead, I felt something else. Exhaustion. The fight had already ended before I even knew it had started. Watching them through the glass felt like watching strangers occupy roles that once belonged to people I loved. I never went inside. I never confronted them. I simply started the truck and drove away. That was the moment I stopped searching for explanations. The moment I stopped asking why. Because sometimes closure is not something another person gives you. Sometimes closure arrives when you finally accept reality. A week later, I signed the divorce papers. The pen felt heavier than it should have. Rain tapped softly against the windows as I wrote my name. When it was finished, I sat quietly for several minutes. My marriage was over. My best friend was gone. My father was buried beneath 6 feet of Texas soil. For the first time in my life, I truly believed I had lost everything. What I did not know was that less than 48 hours later, a phone call from a man named Michael Turner would reveal that my father had spent decades protecting a secret so enormous it would make everything I thought I knew about my family completely collapse. The call came at 9:17 on a Tuesday morning. I remember the exact time because I almost ignored it. Unknown number. Dallas area code. I was standing in my father's garage sorting through old boxes, trying to decide what to keep and what to donate. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight coming from the high windows. The place smelled like motor oil, cedar wood, and memories. For a second, I considered letting the call go to voicemail. Then something made me answer. "Mr. Harrison?" a calm voice asked. "This is Michael Turner. I was your father's attorney." I leaned against an old workbench and closed my eyes. Hearing someone refer to my father in the past tense still felt wrong. "What can I do for you?" I asked. There was a brief pause. "Actually, Mr. Harrison, I believe it is what your father intended to do for you." The sentence sounded strange enough to make me pay attention. Michael asked if I could come to his office the following morning. He refused to discuss details over the phone. When I pressed for answers, he simply said there were matters regarding my father's estate that required my signature and personal review. Estate. The word almost made me laugh. My father owned a modest house, an old truck, some tools, and a few savings accounts. There was not much to discuss. At least that was what I believed. The next morning, I drove to downtown Fort Worth beneath a gray sky that threatened rain. Michael Turner's office occupied the upper floor of a quiet brick building overlooking Sundance Square. The lobby was polished marble and dark wood, the kind of place successful people visited. I felt out of place the moment I walked inside. Michael greeted me personally. He was in his late 60s, silver-haired, perfectly dressed, and carried himself with the confidence of someone who never wasted words. He led me into a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. A thick folder sat waiting on the table. "Before we begin," he said, "your father instructed me to deliver something." He slid a sealed envelope across the table. My name was written on the front in my father's handwriting. Suddenly the room felt very quiet. My hands hesitated before opening it. Inside was a single letter. I recognized the handwriting immediately. Steady, precise, familiar. Son, if you are reading this, then I am gone. I wish I had more time. There are things I wanted to explain face to face. Life did not give us that opportunity. What you are about to learn may feel impossible. It certainly felt impossible the first time I planned it. I stared at the page. My pulse quickened. The letter continued. Your entire life, people judged me by what they could see. I allowed them to. Sometimes the greatest protection comes from being underestimated. Wealth attracts attention. Attention attracts the wrong people. I chose a different path. My eyes moved faster. Confusion gave way to disbelief. Then came the sentence that changed everything. You are the sole beneficiary of the Harrison family trust. I lowered the paper. What trust? I asked. Michael did not answer immediately. Instead, he opened the folder and turned it toward me. Page after page appeared. Corporate ownership records, financial statements, property portfolios, investment reports, documents from companies I had never heard of. Numbers covered every page. Millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions. I honestly thought there had been some mistake. This cannot be right, I said. Michael adjusted his glasses. I assure you, Mr. Harrison, it is correct. He began explaining. My grandfather had started a small energy services company decades earlier. My father expanded it quietly through partnerships, acquisitions, and long-term investments. Over time, the business grew into multiple companies. Those companies generated other investments. The investments generated more assets. Everything had been held through trusts, holding companies, and private entities designed to remain invisible to the public. I listened, but the words felt unreal. Like someone describing another family's history, not mine. Finally, I asked the only question that mattered. How much? Michael looked directly at me. Based on current valuations, approximately $512 million. The room seemed to tilt. $512 million. My father had spent years driving an old truck, years fixing things himself, years living in the same modest home. Meanwhile, he had quietly built a financial empire hidden beneath plain sight. Michael slid another page toward me. It listed private properties, commercial real estate holdings, investment funds, and ownership stakes spread across multiple states. I could barely process any of it. Then I remembered something. A question my father asked weeks before he died. Who stays when things get hard? At the time, I thought it was about illness. Sitting in that conference room, staring at documents worth more money than I could comprehend, I suddenly understood. My father had not been testing the market. He had been testing people. And for the first time since Rebecca left, I realized the timing of everything might not have been a tragedy. It might have been a revelation. For the first few weeks after that meeting, I felt like a man carrying someone else's life. Every morning, I woke up expecting the entire thing to dissolve into a misunderstanding. Then I would remember the documents, the accounts, the properties, the companies. $512 million does not disappear because it feels unbelievable. Neither does responsibility. Michael Turner became my guide through a world I never knew existed. 3 times a week, I sat in conference rooms reviewing reports that looked like they belonged in another language. Investment portfolios, corporate structures, energy holdings, commercial developments. At first, the numbers blurred together. Millions became tens of millions. Tens of millions became percentages. Percentages became decisions. I realized very quickly that inheriting wealth was not the same thing as understanding it. My father had spent decades building something extraordinary. The last thing I wanted was to destroy it through ignorance. So I studied. Every day, every night. I read annual reports instead of watching television. I listened during meetings instead of pretending I understood. I asked questions. Hundreds of questions. The strange thing was that nobody treated me like an imposter. They treated me like the future owner. That scared me more than anything. During that first year, I sold the house Rebecca and I had shared. Not because I needed the money, because I needed distance. Every room contained a memory. Every hallway carried echoes of a life that no longer existed. I moved into a modest condominium overlooking the Trinity River. It was comfortable, quiet, and anonymous. Exactly what I wanted. Most people assume wealth changes everything overnight. The truth is more complicated. I still woke up early. I still made my own coffee. I still drove myself places. The biggest difference was freedom. For the first time in my life, every decision belonged entirely to me. There were no financial limitations. No ceilings. No invisible barriers. Just possibilities. About 18 months after inheriting the trust, Michael invited me to visit one of the largest properties in the portfolio. It was a sprawling ranch in West Texas stretching across thousands of acres beneath endless blue sky. As we drove through the gates, I felt something unexpected. Recognition. Not because I had been there before, because it felt familiar. The same values my father lived by were built into everything he created. Long-term thinking, patience, quiet confidence. Nothing flashy, nothing wasteful. Standing on a ridge overlooking miles of open land, I finally understood why he had hidden everything. Wealth was never the point. Freedom was. Security was. Legacy was. Around that same time, I stopped checking Rebecca's social media. I stopped asking mutual friends for updates. I stopped wondering whether Brandon ever felt guilty. Those questions gradually lost their power. Not because I forgave them, because my attention was finally focused somewhere else. Healing is not dramatic. It happens quietly, one ordinary day at a time. The second year became the third. The third became the fourth. I expanded several investments, acquired new businesses, built relationships with experienced executives who challenged me to grow. The version of me who sat alone at that kitchen table staring at divorce papers slowly disappeared. In his place stood someone stronger. Not harder, stronger. There is a difference. One autumn evening, I returned to my father's house before it was scheduled for renovation. The sun was setting behind the fields, painting everything gold. I sat on the back porch where we used to talk and watched the horizon fade into darkness. For a long time I said nothing. Then I unfolded the letter he left me and read it again. Certain lines felt different now, especially one sentence. People reveal themselves when they think there is nothing left to gain. For years earlier, those words felt philosophical. Now they felt precise, almost surgical. My father had not simply left me wealth. He had left me clarity, the ability to see people as they truly were. As the last light disappeared beyond the fields, my phone vibrated with a notification. An article from a business publication. My photograph appeared beside the headline announcing another successful acquisition. For a moment, I stared at the screen. Then I looked toward the empty chair beside me, the chair where my father used to sit. I smiled for the first time that day. What I did not know was that hundreds of miles away, two people were beginning to experience the exact opposite trajectory. While my life continued rising, theirs was slowly starting to unravel. By the fifth year, I rarely thought about Rebecca or Brandon unless someone else mentioned them first. Life has a way of creating distance where time alone cannot. My days were full. Board meetings, site visits, investment reviews, long conversations about growth, strategy, and opportunity. The future demanded attention, and I had finally stopped living in the past. That did not mean information stopped finding me. In business, people talk. In Texas, they talk even more. News travels across cities, industries, and social circles with surprising speed. The first update came from an old mutual friend I ran into at a charity event in Dallas. We exchanged pleasantries, talked about work, and eventually the conversation drifted toward people we used to know. He hesitated before mentioning their names. "Things are not going great for them," he said carefully. I remember nodding without asking for details. At the time, I genuinely did not care. Or at least I thought I did not. A few months later, another piece of information arrived. Then another. Individually, none of it meant much. Together, they painted a picture. Rebecca and Brandon had married less than a year after the divorce became final. Looking back, that timeline surprised absolutely nobody except me. They bought a large house outside Dallas. Expensive neighborhood, luxury vehicles, country club memberships, the kind of lifestyle designed to be seen. For a while, it appeared they had everything they wanted. Social media showed vacations, celebrations, smiling photographs, and carefully curated success. I recognized the pattern because I had once believed those images myself. The trouble with appearances is that they are often funded by assumptions. Brandon had always been confident. Sometimes confidence is earned. Sometimes it is borrowed from optimism. According to people who knew him, he became obsessed with chasing bigger opportunities, new ventures, speculative investments, partnerships that promised rapid growth. Every few months there seemed to be another announcement, another project, another ambitious plan. My father used to say that slow money sleeps well at night. Fast money rarely does. Around year 3 of their marriage, the cracks began showing. One business venture failed to meet expectations. Then another. Financing became difficult. Debt accumulated quietly, the same way problems usually do. Not all at once. One decision at a time. Meanwhile, Rebecca faced challenges of her own. The career trajectory she once expected did not materialize the way she imagined. Promotions went elsewhere. Opportunities became more competitive. The lifestyle they built required constant maintenance. Expensive homes do not care whether income is growing. Neither do luxury payments. Pressure has a way of revealing character. The stories I heard became increasingly familiar. Arguments about money. Disagreements about priorities. Frustration replacing excitement. Resentment replacing admiration. None of it sounded dramatic. It sounded human. One evening, after a long meeting in Houston, I found myself thinking about something Michael Turner told me years earlier. Success rarely changes people. It exposes them. At the time, I assumed he was talking about wealth. Later, I realized the same principle applies to hardship. Difficulty reveals people too. Around that same period, I received a photograph from a former colleague of Rebecca's. Not out of malice. Simply because she thought I might find it interesting. The image showed Rebecca at a networking event. 5 years had passed since the divorce. She looked older. Not because of age. Because of disappointment. There is a difference. I stared at the photograph for a few seconds before setting my phone down. To my surprise, I felt no satisfaction. No revenge. No triumph. Just perspective. There was a time when I believed their happiness came at the cost of mine. Now I understood something different. People carry their choices with them. Every day, every year, every consequence. The following spring, another business publication featured one of my companies on its cover. The article detailed several acquisitions and highlighted future expansion plans. I barely thought about it after publication. What I did not know was that the magazine would eventually find its way into Rebecca and Brandon's world. And when it did, they would finally learn the truth about the man they believed had been left with nothing. The truth my father spent decades protecting. The truth that was about to bring our paths together again after 5 long years apart. The invitation arrived on a Monday morning buried among a dozen routine emails. At first glance it looked unremarkable. An investment summit in Dallas. Private attendance. Limited participants. Executives, venture capital groups, and business owners from across the state. My company had sponsored similar events before, so I almost forwarded it to someone else. Then I noticed a familiar name on the attendee list. Brandon Pierce. I stared at the screen for a moment before leaning back in my chair. 5 years. 5 years without a conversation. 5 years without seeing either of them in person. Strange how a name can instantly transport you into a chapter of life you thought was permanently closed. I almost declined the invitation. Then curiosity won. The summit was held at a luxury hotel overlooking downtown Dallas. Glass towers reflected the afternoon sun, while valet attendants moved between luxury vehicles lined along the entrance. The ballroom buzzed with conversation and polished optimism. People exchanged business cards, discussed opportunities, and talked about growth projections as though the future were something that could be scheduled. I spent most of the afternoon in meetings. By the time the final presentation approached, I had nearly forgotten Brandon was somewhere in the building. Then one of the organizers approached me. "The investors are assembled upstairs," she said. "Conference room 12. I nodded and followed her toward the executive floor. The hallway was quiet compared to the crowded ballroom below. Thick carpet softened every footstep. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city skyline stretching toward the horizon. When we reached the conference room doors, she smiled and stepped aside. "They are waiting for you." I pushed the doors open. Conversation stopped immediately. Around a long, polished table sat nearly a dozen people. Some I recognized. Others were strangers. And there, halfway down the table, sat Brandon Pierce. For a moment, he did not recognize me. 5 years changes people. The last time he saw me, I was grieving my father, losing my marriage, and trying to understand a collapsing life. The man walking into that room was not the same person. Then recognition arrived. I watched it happen in real time. Confusion first, then surprise, then disbelief. His expression froze. Across from him sat Rebecca. My breath caught for the briefest moment. She looked almost exactly as I remembered, and completely different at the same time. Age had not changed her. Life had. The confidence I remembered seemed thinner now, more fragile. Her eyes widened as she stared at me standing at the head of the table. Nobody spoke. The silence stretched several seconds longer than normal. Finally, one of the organizers smiled. "Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to introduce the lead investor for today's partnership review, Mr. Cole Harrison." The room erupted into polite applause. Everyone except two people. Brandon looked like a man trying to solve a math problem that made no sense. Rebecca simply stared. I took my seat and opened the presentation folder in front of me. Years earlier, I might have enjoyed the moment. I might have savored their shock. Instead, I felt oddly calm. My father's voice echoed in memory. "Wealth attracts attention. Attention attracts the wrong people." The meeting began. Numbers appeared on screens. Growth projections were discussed. Acquisition opportunities were reviewed. For nearly 40 minutes, I focused entirely on business. Yet every time I looked across the table, I noticed the same thing. Rebecca and Brandon were barely paying attention. They were watching me, trying to understand, trying to connect the impossible pieces. Eventually, the meeting ended. Attendees gathered documents and exchanged handshakes. One by one, they filtered into the hallway. I remained behind reviewing notes. A few minutes later, I heard the conference room door close again. When I looked up, only two people remained. Rebecca stood near the doorway, Brandon beside her. Neither seemed sure where to begin. The years between us suddenly felt very small. Brandon cleared his throat first. "Cole," he said quietly. It was the first time I had heard his voice in half a decade. Rebecca looked down briefly before meeting my eyes again. "We had no idea," she whispered. I studied both of them in silence. 5 years earlier, those words would have meant everything. Now they meant almost nothing. Because the truth was simple. My father had been right. They had revealed exactly who they were when they believed there was nothing left to gain. And now, standing in that conference room, they were finally beginning to understand what they had actually walked away from. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The city skyline glowed beyond the conference room windows while the silence settled over us like dust after a long storm. Brandon looked older than I remembered, not because of age, because of regret. Rebecca stood with her hands folded in front of her, searching my face for something she could still recognize. 5 years earlier, I probably would have wanted answers. I probably would have wanted explanations. Standing there now, I realized I no longer needed either. "Cole," Brandon said again, his voice quieter this time. "We never knew." I nodded once. I know. The strange thing was that I meant it. They truly had not known. They believed my father was an ordinary man. They believed I was an ordinary man. They believed they were walking away from a future with limitations and toward one with greater possibilities. They made their decision based on the information they had. The problem was not that they were wrong about the money. The problem was why the money mattered so much in the first place. Rebecca took a small step forward. "If I had known," she began. Then she stopped. The sentence hung unfinished between us. I smiled sadly. "That is exactly the point," I said. Her eyes lowered immediately, because we all understood what those words meant. If she had known, things might have been different. If Brandon had known, things might have been different. But my father had spent his entire life proving a lesson most people never learn. Character only reveals itself when there is nothing obvious to gain. Wealth does not create loyalty. It exposes the lack of it. Nobody argued. Nobody defended themselves. There was nothing left to defend. Brandon eventually asked about the businesses. Rebecca asked about my father. The conversation remained polite, civil, almost strangely normal considering everything that had happened. Yet underneath every word sat the same truth. We were not discussing money. We were discussing choices. Choices made years ago. Choices that could never be undone. After a few minutes, Rebecca looked at me with tears gathering in her eyes. She was not crying dramatically. She simply looked tired. "I am sorry," she said. "For all of it." I believed her. That surprised me. For years I imagined this moment differently. I imagined anger, satisfaction, vindication. Instead, I felt something closer to peace. Because forgiveness is not always about the other person. Sometimes it is the final gift you give yourself. I nodded. "I know," I said quietly. Brandon looked down at the conference table. I wish I had been a better friend. I thought about the years we spent together. The memories. The trust. The disappointment. Then I remembered something my father once told me while repairing a fence on a hot summer afternoon. Some people enter your life for the journey. Others enter your life for the lesson. It takes time to learn which is which. "Take care of yourselves," I said. That was all. No speech. No revenge. No dramatic ending. Just the truth. A few minutes later, they left the conference room. The door closed softly behind them. And just like that, the chapter was over. I stood alone by the window overlooking Dallas. Traffic moved through the streets below. The sun was beginning to set, casting gold across the glass towers surrounding the city. For a moment, I thought about everything that had happened. Losing my father, losing my marriage, losing my closest friend. At the time, those losses felt like the end of my story. Looking back, they were the beginning of it. Later that evening, I drove to my father's ranch. The air smelled of dry grass and distant rain. I sat on the porch as the last light faded across the horizon. Beside me rested the letter he left behind years earlier. I read the final paragraph one more time. Then I looked out across the land he spent a lifetime protecting. The greatest inheritance he left me was never the money. It was perspective. It was wisdom. It was the ability to recognize who remained when circumstances became difficult. Money can build opportunities. Character builds a life. And character is worth far more. As darkness settled across the Texas sky, I found myself wondering something. If you were in my position, would you have made the same choice? Would you have forgiven them? Or would you have walked away differently? Let me know your thoughts, because every person sees a story like this through their own experiences. And if stories about resilience, hard-earned lessons, and unexpected second chances mean something to you, consider subscribing so you do not miss the next journey. I folded my father's letter carefully, placed it back inside the envelope, and watched the stars appear one by one above the ranch. For the first time in a very long time, the future felt exactly where it belonged. Ahead of me.